Well, welcome, friends. It's good to see you again for the third of our 5 reflections on the life of David. And having thought in our first 2 sessions about David's anointing and then his defeat of Goliath, we're now fast forwarding several chapters to the end of the book of 1 Samuel and then the beginning of 2 Samuel. When I read how this first book ends and the next starts, it reminds me of something you might watch on Netflix. It's as if 1 Samuel 31 is a cliffhanger, the end of season finale that concludes with Saul and 3 of his sons being killed. And then we turn over the page to the next chapter and season 2 begins with David learning about what has happened and singing the lament that we find in the second half of 2 Samuel verse chapter 1. At this point, it feels as if the story of David is now ready to really get going. The king is dead, and we can look forward to saying, "Long live the king." And yet it's not as simple as that. Because even though we know David has long ago been anointed as Saul's successor, there is still at least one other man who could make a legitimate claim to the throne, and that's Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth. So in 2 Samuel 2, David moves quickly to have himself anointed publicly as king in Hebron. He also sends a message to some of Saul's followers that he will show them favour. It's like the classic play of the new leader who wants people to know that he wants to bring them together under his leadership. But things are not as simple as David might have hoped for, because another coronation is taking place at the same time. We're told that Ishbosheth is also crowned as king. And in the chapters that follow, we read about a very violent and bloody struggle for power, which David, of course, wins. And he wins in a way which I think displays both his political skills, but also his ruthlessness. When you read these chapters, you will learn of 6 people who die, each of whom are between David and the throne. You have Saul and his 3 sons. You have Abner, Saul's former military commander, and you have the final son of Saul, Ishbosheth. And David benefits from all of these deaths, but he isn't responsible for any of them. Saul and 3 of his sons die at the hand of the Philistines, who David has actually been encamped with for some time at the end of the book of 1 Samuel. Abner is killed by Joab, who is always willing to get his hands dirty for David. And Ishbosheth is killed by assassins. And David is never left holding the smoking gun. To use a phrase that we might hear on the lips of modern politicians, he always has plausible deniability. And I'm also struck by one other aspect of this story. You'll see this as you read through these chapters. When each of these figures dies, David always leads the mourning and does so very publicly. So this is one of the most violent and disturbing episodes that we read in the whole of the David story, and I found myself wondering what to make of it. How do we make sense of it? And again, perhaps I can offer 3 brief reflections, 3 reminders which I think this story provides. Firstly, I think there's a reminder of how God can be at work in circumstances which we might find very troubling or disturbing. One of the things I think we have to keep in mind as we read a story like David's is that it is describing events that took place in a time very different to ours, and a very long time ago from ours, 3,000 years ago. David is having to plot his way through a very complex and dangerous world, a very violent one. It's not a world where people sit down to talk things through in a calm and reasonable manner, and then at the end of the day shake hands on things. If David had pursued a policy of peace and diplomacy, it probably wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. My guess is that people who lived in David's time might not have been as appalled by this violence as we are. I think they would probably just have accepted that that was just how the world was. And yet in all of that mess, God is moving forward his purposes for history. And that is a mystery we have to reckon with throughout the David story. The hard though it may be for us to accept how he does things, David is presented to us as a figure who is seeking God and who God has his hand upon. Right at the beginning of 2 Samuel 2, just before he is anointed as king, there's a very telling little detail. We're told in verse 1 that David inquired of the Lord about where he should go. And God, who has his heart upon him, sees him through all of this. Secondly, it seems to me that there is a reminder in this story of the need for wisdom and shrewdness. And I think there's a strong case for saying that David has these qualities in bucket loads. He certainly has them far more than Saul does. When you go back to the Old Testament and you dig a little bit deeper into the Hebrew words, which our Bibles conventionally translate with words like wise or wisdom, you find that there are layers of nuance and meaning contained within them. You have words like bina, which has at its root the idea of being discerning, of being able to perceive what is really going on. Another word is haskell, which carries a sense of savvy, of knowing what to do at the right time. And then there's the word orma, which could even be translated as crafty. It can have positive or negative connotations, but it's recognised as a good skill to have for life. And as I said a moment ago, it seems to me that when we look at David's life, these are qualities he possessed in abundance to somehow plot a course through this very complex maze and come out on top. It's quite a feat on David's part. And David did have this capacity for being streetwise. He knows what to do at the right time. And it was part of how God used him. When he has to fight Goliath, when he's on the run, he can find a way through these situations. And yet I also feel we need to finish with a note of caution and a final reminder that comes to me in this story. And that's about the need to guard our souls. For me, there is something troubling about these stories. I can't help feeling that even as David is succeeding and winning and coming out on top, there is still trouble coming down the line. So often with leaders, it is as they rise that the seeds of their downfall are being sown. And I think that applies to David as well. I find myself wondering about the people he has around him. We now see Job appearing as a prominent figure for the first time. Job is the ultimate fixer, the guy who is willing to get his hands dirty for David. Later, in 2 Samuel, when David wants to see Uriah move to the front line, when he discovers Bathsheba's pregnancy, it will be Joab who does his bidding. And at a deeper level, I find myself thinking about this pattern of deaths which occur, which prove to be advantageous to David. What does it say about someone? That they are willing to allow violence to unfold in the knowledge that they will benefit from it. David is content, it seems, to keep a distance from the mess of what is happening. And later, when a crisis erupts in his family, he continues to keep a distance. To use a modern term, does this suggest a tendency on the part of David to compartmentalise? And then finally, there's one other detail in this story, which I don't think we can avoid mentioning. You will have read about it at the beginning of 2 Samuel 3. The fact that in the midst of all the fighting between Abner and Ashel and Job and Abner, we might be wondering what David is getting up to. And in an interlude between all this violence, the first 5 verses of 2 Samuel 3 tell us about how David is with lots of women. He is spending time fathering lots of little Davids. He has 6 children by 6 different women. And again, we might want to wonder about what that teaches us about his capacity for putting different aspects of his life into different compartments. What that tells us about how he relates to women. And at the moment, he might think this is okay. He might think he is getting away with it. But as with so much in life, you get away with things until you stop getting away with things. But there will be more of that in weeks to come. So friends, I hope you find these reflections helpful, as well as the questions that you can talk about now in your groups. So I'll say bye for now, and I'll see you next week.